Welcome, everyone. Good to have you all here on this Thursday night as we continue in Exodus. Um, Last week, we we were in the end of Exodus 20, and we were beginning with the commandment of not to covet. And we talked a little bit about that, about what coveting means, wanting something you have no right to, and it's often driven by envy and discontent. We also discussed that people they were afraid of hearing that voice on Mount Sinai, so they asked Moses, "Say, don't tell God not to talk to us directly. He'll just kill us. It will die. To have him talk to you, and then you tell us." And so God said, "Okay." And so that's what he did. So he started talking to Moses, and he tell Moses what to tell them. And so as we moved into there was he became the mediator, and he talked about altars. You remember that, how they would make altars of dirt and of the actually of the earth, which would include rocks and dirt and stuff like that. And then we go into the final verses of the chapter, which bridge the Ten Commandments into chapter 21, which we were into last week. And that we moved into ordinances. Now, ordinance, they're a little bit different than commands. They're more specific. So we started out with um, in Exodus 21, verse 1, we started getting into some of these ordinances. And they're a part of the Torah, and the Torah really means instruction. Some people say it means law, but it's more than law, it's instructions. And these ancient ordinances address things like involving people, slavery, animals, but they didn't talk about cars or modern things, but we can apply these things to modern day stuff. And I'm going to try to highlight some of that stuff this evening. And so we talked about slavery, and it's kind of a unique situation. Um, if you would go in, the reason for slavery, it's not like the chattel slavery of the in the Americas in the 1800s, where you bought slaves, and oftentimes people were forced into slavery, and then they became the property of the owners, and the owners could basically do whatever they wanted to until the day they died. It was very harsh and cruel and disgusting, and it was eventually outlawed. But sometimes people take that mentality and they apply it to God. You mean God condoned slavery? Well, the answer is yes, he did, but not that kind of slavery. Totally, totally, totally different. And that's what we discussed last week. If a person couldn't pay a debt, say, for instance, you didn't have the money, you stole cattle or you stole oxen or you stole sheep or you did whatever you did, and you say you ate them or whatever, and you didn't have the money, what you could do, see, they had reciprocation. It wasn't like, oh, okay, sorry, that's okay. We'll throw you in jail for a month and it's all gone. What they would do is you'd have to sell yourself into slavery to the person who you owed the money to, or you hurt, or whatever it was, for 6 years. That was the maximum. If you owed them $100 or you owed them 2,000, you went in for 6 years and you became a part of that family. And you weren't hit with whips, and you weren't beaten, and you weren't this, that, and the other. You became a servant, but it was beyond a servant because you didn't have the option not to for 6 years. And then at the end of the 6 years, the master would give you a ton of supplies, because they just didn't throw you out on the street and say, nice seeing you. You'd get back into the same situation fairly quickly. They gave you food, they helped you to get on your feet and get going. It was a very loving, humane way of dealing with crimes. Clean. It was actually genteel, is gentle. And some slaves said, my masters are so good, and I really love this family. I want to stay your servant. So they go down to the judge, and the judge says, sounds good. And they give him a piercing. Today we see these big piercings, we see little ones, but they gave him a big one. So there's a hole in his lobe. They put an awl through there. And that signified that he was a slave to this master. His slavery, his servitude would end when his master died. Then he was free to go. Or it ended at the end of a jubilee. Now, if you study the Old Testament, I think it was every 50 years they celebrated this jubilee. God made a big deal out of it. And then all these slaves, as part of the celebration, were let go free. The ones who had said they're going to be for all time. So then we get into the details. What if he comes in married? Well, then he keeps his wife. But what if he comes in single? Well, he leaves. What if he comes in? All these different details, which are very interesting and wonderful on how God treats people so fairly and kindly. So it was really a good way to handle it. They didn't have any prisons. They didn't lock you up for 10 years because you stole somebody's car. If you stole somebody's car, then you just became their servant for 6 years. And at the end of 6 years, you're let free. Didn't have to pay for penitentiaries, didn't have to do. And actually, we talked about penitentiaries are kind of our modern day slavery. Because what happens when you're in a penitentiary? You eat what they say you can eat. You do what they say you can do. You wear what you say. You go to bed. You get up, all this stuff. That wasn't how God did his servants, his slaves. They did what the master said, and they had good masters. And if they had bad masters, God had something to say about that too. And that's what we're going to be getting into tonight. So let's take a look at Exodus chapter. We went through verse, I didn't go through the whole rundown, but I think I gave you a good overview. And we even talked about marital rights too. And I think it's a very interesting subject because women did have good grounds for leaving their husbands or in a situation for certain things. And that we discussed last week. But anyhow, we went through the first 11 verses, and now we're into Exodus chapter 21. And we're starting out in verse 11. So I'm going to share my screen here. And as you guys know, I use the Revised English Version as the text for my teachings. And I get things out of the commentary. I also use the Dennis Prager commentary. If you guys are aware of Dennis Prager, really nice Jewish commentary, man. And I like to read a Jewish commentary because guess what? The Old Testament was written for Jewish people predominantly and for us, because the Bible tells in the New Testament it's all for instruction. So it's very important that we understand the Old Testament, and it's good to have a person who knows the Jewish religion so he can make his comments on how it so we can understand a little bit better. Okay, so now I'm going to share my screen, and we'll see how well it does. Sometimes it does really well. Maybe this will be a night it does. Any gray? It hasn't popped up yet. No gray. Yay. Good. I guess that whatever I did worked. Okay. All right. Good deal. So we're in Exodus. Let me go back here to Exodus 21. We're in Exodus 21. And if you want to, you can just look on the screen if you have access to it, or you can open up your app or just listen out, whatever suits you. So tonight we're talking about laws for personal injury. Now, these are the ordinances. Remember the setting. We're still at Mount Sinai, and everybody knows Mount Sinai because we've probably all seen the movie with Charlton Heston, The Ten Commandments. And Mount Sinai is, if you're familiar with the Sinai Peninsula, it kind of looks like an arrowhead pointing down. What's right in the bottom is kind of in the point of that arrow. Now, I've shown maps almost every week, but I didn't pull it up again this week. But this is where they're at. So they're there for a period of time. They've been there for a while. And now God is moving on and telling Moses what to tell the children of Israel because they don't want God talking to him. He's apparently too scary. So in verse 12, here we go, personal injury. If anyone who strikes a person so that he dies, he must be put to death. Yes, death. Oh my gosh. I remember when I first read this years ago, I kind of struggled with this. And I know people in our modern times, they think that's inhumane. What a horrible thing to do. But when you think about it, when you really think about it, if a person knows if they kill someone else that they're going to be put to death, yes, death, that's kind of a deterrent. I think we'd have far less murders today if people knew that there would be that severe consequence. Now, we still have a lot of murders today, even though 27 states still have the death penalty. But I'm going to tell you some of the caveats that kind of takes the real punch out of that stuff. And I'm going to, as we get in a little bit later. So we know we got a lot of problems today. We see all kinds of heinous crimes going on. And I think we would like the world to be a lot safer if a lot of these things were greatly reduced. Now, the biblical solution for violent crime is the death penalty. The Bible supports it. It's not just an Old Testament law. We see it supported in the New Testament as well. The death penalty was not invented by humans to solve social problems. It was a commandment of God to deal with these crimes that threatens life and safety. Now, I know if this is coming across harsh, just let it settle, think about it. You don't have to make a decision tonight. It took me probably about a year or so of just reading this over and over and thinking about it, where I finally kind of really settled in that, yeah, this really makes sense. But just take your time. Don't get worked up. Don't be offended. This is what God really says to do. But think about it, give it a shot and see the logic behind it. God is showing the value of human life. When a person commits a murder and receives a lesser penalty, it sends a message that human life really just isn't worth that much. You can go out and kill somebody and you go to jail for so many years and it's done. You get out on parole and life goes on. But God shows that life is extremely valuable. And the only adequate compensation for taking a life unjustly is to take the life of the murderer. Now, many people misunderstand this because the King James translation of the sixth commandment says, "Thou shalt not kill." And they say, okay, death penalty is wrong. We don't kill. Well, okay, well, yes, we do kill, right? We kill lots of times in different ways. And as we look at this, the Hebrew word for kill is really for murder. And if you look at the modern translations, you'll see they translated that it's against God's will to murder. Now, murder is when you plan it, it's premeditated, you do it. And that's a different kind of murder. Now God very quickly says things like accidents, like manslaughter or something. That's a totally different deal. That's not murder. But that's the first commandment. That's what he's saying right here in verse 12. And we'll see that the principle throughout the scripture is carried out. Moses, there was a couple executions under Moses, and Joshua, if you remember Achan and what he did, and Samuel and Agag, David, a couple there, and Solomon with Joab and I think his brother. So this has been carried out. So let's take a look here. Let's look at some New Testament stuff here. And we're going to go to 1 Timothy. But first of all, yeah. Well, let me look at Ecclesiastes really quick here. Ecclesiastes says there is a time to kill. And in verse 3 of chapter 3, and it goes on a time to heal, a time to tear down. You've heard the song, right? I forget the name of the group who sang that song back in the 60s or 70s. There is a season, turn, turn, turn.
The
And they
bird.
sang the birds. There we go. Thank you, Doug. But there is a time to kill. And God makes that clear when that time is. Let's look at 1 Timothy for a New Testament view of this. 1 Timothy chapter 1 and in verse 8. But we know the law is good when it's used as God intended. This is a tremendous verse. The law is good. Now we're talking about the law, and that's what we're reading right now. It is good when it's used as God intended it to. So God puts a lot of heart into his law. And a lot of things, there are exceptions, and it's not always black and white. And we need to understand that. And it takes righteousness and love and justice to carry out some of these things, because in certain times things change, and we've seen these variations. So we'll get into more of this later, but let's keep moving here. We got some ground to cover. In verse 9, we also know the law is not, oh no, I'm sorry, let's go back to Exodus, and we'll go on to the next one. But if it is not premeditated, which is like manslaughter or an accident, but God, but God let him fall into his hand, then I will point for you a place where he can flee. So if it's not premeditated, then what we'll learn this later on, God set up what he called, which is a familiar term for us today, but it was different back then, a sanctuary city. The person who committed manslaughter could go to the city and he could stay there and he could be safe. Because one of the things God wanted to protect people that accidentally killed others was the vengeance of the family. If you accidentally, and you'll see this done today, people are accidentally killed, but the hurt and the pain that the parents or the loved ones go through, they really want this guy to pay or this woman to pay. So God set up these sanctuary cities to keep them safe, and not have them killed. Now in verse 16, but if a man maliciously schemes against his neighbor, and now we're talking about the definition of murder. Today we call it first degree. You must take him from the altar to put him to the death. Now, what's that mean? From the altar? Well, um, it would be that if sometimes they would go into the temple, which they didn't have one there, but other altars, and grab the altars as a form of refuge from God. And God says, no, there's no refuge here. If you maliciously schemed and murdered your neighbor to kill him, then take him from the altar. There's no reprieve here. You got to take care of this. And so things haven't changed. The Bible talks about, when there's these laws, these moral laws still hold ground. Now, certain things have changed in the Old Testament, and we know that because God tells us about those. Sacrifices have changed. Circumcision is no longer required. But there's no record of God changing the rule on capital punishment. But we should be very careful when we say it's too harsh, because we shouldn't accuse God of any wrongdoing. Now, he gave these laws, whether or not they suit our modern sensibilities, they reflect his goodness. Modern law tends to go easy on the criminals and neglect the innocent, where God's biblical law was very firm against the guilty and protective toward the innocent. And we'll see this come up over and over again. So one of the main objections to say that against is, well, what if the witnesses, that witnesses and even attorneys will say that. And people get very worried about, maybe we're putting to death somebody who didn't do it. Well, God has some answers for that. It requires two eyewitnesses, two capable eyewitnesses are required. And then if somebody lies about it, then let's take a look what it says about that. We're going to take a look at Ecclesiastes chapter 8. And we're going to go to Deuteronomy first. Deuteronomy chapter 19, verse 16. If a malicious witness rise up against any person to testify against of wrongdoing, then this is a malicious witness. This means someone that is lying about it, rises up against any person to testify against him of wrongdoing. Okay, say this would, yeah, I killed him. He killed him. I saw it. I saw him kill him. And then both of the people, what happens if this malicious witness rises, then both the people who have the dispute must stand before God, which is before the priests and the judges, who will be in office in those days, and the judges are to make a diligent inquisition. And behold, if the witness is a false witness and he testified falsely against his brother, then you must do to him as he had planned to do to his brother. In this way, you must purge the evil from your midst. So what we're seeing here is if you got a perjurer, which we call perjury today, and you lie to try to get someone in trouble or actually receive the death penalty, and you're found out, guess what? You're penalized the same way as the person that you were lying about. So they both get the death penalty. Now, I think that would go a long way to curtailing perjury. So back in the day, and then there's one other thing that I think is very important here. That's in Ecclesiastes. So, so if you're going to have the death penalty, you need two eyewitnesses, and you got to make sure your witnesses are truthful. And if they're not, you do what I just read there in Deuteronomy. And then in Ecclesiastes chapter 11, it says, because the sentence against an evil act is not executed speedily, therefore the hearts of the Son of Men is fully set in them to do evil. So here we have speedy justice. Back in biblical days, if they would have a trial, and if they had two eyewitnesses, that two credible eyewitnesses, the execution was carried out very quickly, often the same day. Now, there was a time where the person being executed on his way to where he was going to be stoned, if he came up with some new evidence, he would get a brief stay and they'd check out the evidence and see how to proceed. But then if he, once the stay was over, then the community did the stoning, and that stoning was led by the witnesses. So God had this all planned out, how things work. And it's kind of surprising and shocking if you've never read this before, but that's what the Bible says. And we'd be wise to follow what he says. I think the thing is, people think, oh, that's horrible. But once a person finds out what's going to happen if they commit a crime, they're most likely not going to do it. But even today, where it talked about in Ecclesiastes for that speedy results of the trial, like the execution. Today, you can be on death row 19 or 20 years. That's the average length on death row is 19 or 20 years. And so what happens is it takes the real punch out of what God was trying to do to curtail these types of crimes from happening. So one day, Jesus is coming back to rule with a rod of iron. And that's going to be during the millennial kingdom. And justice is going to be swift. And those who commit evil will have to face certain punishment, because there will be natural people here on earth during that time. And so I'm not going to read to you. You can look this up later, but if you want, Isaiah 63, 2-4 deals with that type of ruling with a rod of iron. And then Revelation 20, verses 11-15 describe how God finally destroys wickedness forever. So this verse in Exodus refers specifically to intentional murder, premeditated killing. Accidental death is treated separately, and we'll see how that comes up as we go. All right, we continue in verse 15. Anyone who strikes his mother or father must be put to death. Yes, death. Wow, there's another one. Wow, really? Yeah. Well, what happens is there's a lot to it. This who strikes his mother or father must be put to death. And we're going to find out more about this. And we're going to let's jump down to 17. If he treats his mother with contempt, a mother or father, he must be put to death. So the family unit was very important. Now, we're not talking about little kids. We're talking about full-grown kids, that they are being vicious and striking their parents. And we can read about this in Romans. There's a verse in Romans where it talks about how they'll when the corrupt minds occur, the deprived minds, they will turn against their parents. So the family unit is important to God, and a strong family unit really helps our society. And children need to obey the first commandment with promise, as we read, is that if we are to honor our mother and father, so our life will be long upon the earth. So God has severe punishment for adult children, older children that treat their parents, physically abuse them, or treat them with contempt. Now, this word contempt can be translated curse. And curses were a big deal. They still are a big deal, even though we don't talk about them much these days. But it's when you actually tried to curse, bring evil on people. And oftentimes God's name would be used to bring that curse upon. So God was not happy with this type of deal. Dennis Prager notes that this likely refers to invoking the name of God in a curse against parents, showing contempt for both God and for the parents. Okay, now let's take a look here in verse 16. Anyone who kidnaps someone and sells him, or if he is found in his hand, must be put to death. So kidnapping is a crime punishable with capital punishment. Now, think of today's sex trafficking. This is a big deal. Children are abducted, hauled away, made sex slaves. Now, what happens today is there's over much concern about protecting those who do these things. But yet the people's lives who are destroyed and the families are devastated are not treated properly. Well, God is very concerned about victims, and he's very harsh on the perpetrators. Well, one of the things is if you know what's going to happen if you do this, that it's going to be swift, just capital punishment, uh, you're going to see this stuff curtailed. So people think, oh, all these people are going to die because of it. And I tell you, people will learn very quickly, I think, and you'll see a much safer society. But think about it. It's a big deal. It's not an easy pill to swallow, especially if you've never been exposed to it. So just give it some time and you might think about it and see what you think. Now, here's another one in verse 18. If men quarrel, okay, see, you got two guys getting a fight, and one strikes the other with a stone or with his fist, but he does not die, but he's confined to his bed. If he rises up again and walks around outside with his staff, now that's not a cane. Men in the Testament, the ancient times, carried a staff, a walking stick. Moses had a staff, and you'll see over and over, you'll see men having staff. When I go on a walk, I carry a staff. It's just something that a piece of a tree that I stripped the bark off. And it helps me walk, especially if it's on the steep area. Or, if a dog comes and wants to bite me, I can shove it away with the staff. Now, if he rises again outside with his staff, which means normal, he's getting back to normal. It's not like he has to use a cane. Then he who strikes him will be acquitted. Only he must pay for the loss of his time until he's healed. Yes, healed. So if he's out of work for 2, 3, 4 weeks, guess what? The guy who did it gets to make sure he gets what he would have made had he not been injured. Now, verse 20. That sounds pretty fair, doesn't it? Matter of fact, some of our laws today do that. However, some of our laws get kind of crazy. You can spill a cup of coffee on you and you get a fairly minor burn, and all of a sudden you get thousands or hundred thousands of dollars. And where you should get whatever, if you had to miss work or that kind of thing, you should be recompensed. But here you get vast fortunes of money, so it makes our society very litigious, and they go after these bigger companies and get a lot of money. And then what happens? Corporations their job is to make a profit, so they have to raise prices to pay for their people suing them. So it's just bad all around. But I think God is very just in how he deals with things, and these things can be applied to today. If a man strikes a slave or female slave with a staff, sounds like he probably was angry, and he dies under his hand, he must be avenged. Yes, avenged. What does that mean? The master has to be put to death, because if you kill somebody, that's what happens. Notwithstanding, if he gets up after a day or two, say he hit him with it, and it just bruised his knee or something, and he gets up to go, he's not avenged. After all, the guy is his slave and he's working for him, you know, so it kind of makes sense. Actually, it makes a lot of sense. Now let's look at verse 22. If a man fights, so men say we got two men in fight again, seems to come up here fairly often. They're fighting. And what happens? Well, they get in a fight, and there's a woman, a pregnant woman around, and then she gets hurt. They hurt a pregnant woman so that her child comes out, causes her to have a miscarriage. And yet no harm follows. He must be fined. Now let's unpack this a little bit. Now, we're not talking about abortion. We're talking about a miscarriage. It's caused accidentally when two men are fighting and a pregnant woman is struck. It's unintentional. Now, the husband of this wife who was pregnant can demand a fine, which is determined through the judicial system. It says right here, as much as the woman's husband demands, and he is to pay according to a judicial assessment. So the woman's husband can make demands. Now, if they're out of whack, it's going to go through a judicial process. Now, it's interesting that God didn't say, well, he owes him so many dollars. The man who was wronged and injured the woman owes him so many dollars, because there's a lot of situations that could come into play. It's to guarantee a fairness and not vengeance. So what we're seeing here, it could be, okay, here's the situation. You got two men fighting, and say the pregnant woman jumps in the middle of the fight to help her husband. Whoa. Well, that's different than if she was an innocent bystander, right? So can you see there might be a difference in the fine? Well, say, for instance, too, that this is a newly wedded couple and this is their very first baby. That might have something to do, because back in the Old Testament times, firstborn were a big deal, especially if they were male. So you can see where God allows the wronged person, the husband of the wronged person, and the courts to figure out something that's fair. You see this idea of some any harm results, then you are to take life for life. So eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burning for burning, wound for wound, and bruise for bruise. And so what we're seeing here is punishment needs to be proportional. If, like I was talking about the coffee burning a person, and then they get all this money, that's not proportional. It needs to be proportional. When things occur, you look at what happened and you judge properly. And that's what God is encouraging. So bruise for bruise, that's minor, right? If an injury of a foot, but then life for life, that's major. And God says stuff specifically on what's supposed to be done. Let's continue in verse 26. If a man strikes his slave eye or his female slave's eye and destroys it, in other words, blinds him, that's not being a good master, right? That's being harsh. Guess what happens? Well, the slave gets to go free. Same thing in verse 27. If he knocks out his slave's tooth or his female slave's tooth, must let him go free. So what are we talking about here? We're talking about improper treatment from a master and his servant that's been in his service for 6 years. You can't be harsh to them or angry. And if that master would do something like that once, he's probably likely to do something like that again. So God doesn't want these people that have moved into 6 years of slavery to be mistreated. So he says, You had your chance, you blew it, they get to go free. I don't care if they were just with you a month, they're done. So you see the justice of God. Now, this just can, God does, he doesn't want to endanger others. And the owner didn't show restraint, and that's what happened. So let's take a look here. Now we got this ox. If an ox gores a man or a woman to death, the ox must be stoned. Yes, stoned, and his flesh must not be eaten. So they got to kill the ox with stoning, but the owner of the ox is acquitted. He's not responsible because everybody, not everybody knows, but if you've lived around a farm or ranch, livestock can be dangerous, especially the bulls. And when I was a kid and we had a bull in our pasture and I wanted to walk down the pond to go fishing, I gave him a lot of room. And so if he looked at me wrong, I was hightailing it out of there. So, they can be dangerous and they can discharge it for no reason. And sometimes, and that's what the case we're talking about now. It happened, and it happened. This person sadly was killed. But so what they do is they kill the animal so he can't do it anymore. And that's it. Now, but if the ox had a habit of goring in the past, say the owner said, yeah, this is a bad ox. He gored these people the other day, didn't kill them, but injured them. And the owner has been warned, hey, you got to watch that ox. You got to keep him tied up. You got to make sure he doesn't hurt anybody. But he didn't keep watch over it. And he has, and the next thing you know, this time the ox gores a man or woman and kills them. Now look what the punishment is. The ox must be stoned, and also its owner must be put to death. It really makes sense. It requires responsibility. When people do things that are wrong, it requires response. Now you can take this to modern day times. Okay, say for instance, you've got a car that's in really bad shape, and you know that you need to get it fixed, and you don't. And people say that thing is just a death trap. And next thing you know, you end up injuring someone, uh, or even killing them. Then you've got a situation there. And so you can apply this stuff into modern day times. Or say, for instance, you have a very aggressive dog, and the dog has attacked people on more than one occasion. You can apply this stuff today stuff, but if it's the first time he's ever done anything bad, it's one thing. But if he continually does it, it's another. So this stuff can be used to make our society safer. The punishment is harsh, excuse me, to people that do the wrong because the innocent are being protected. But if everybody knows what the punishment will be, then they get to choose whether to obey it or not. And if they obey it, they get the benefits. And if they don't, they get the consequences. And the next thing you know, our society becomes a lot safer. If a ransom is imposed on him, then whatever is imposed on him, he can give for the redemption of his life. Now, this is what we're talking about, this ox that the man owned the ox that he knew was mean, and he finally ended up killing someone. Well, the family can say, well, we don't want to see him stoned or put to death, but we will take a fine. And so they can do that. And of course, the same process would be the judges would get involved. And then so the man who rightfully could be stoned is now allowed to pay a fine instead. So you see, flexibility is here. It's always not cut and dry. Now, if it is gored a son or granddaughter, according to the same rule, it's done. So it doesn't matter if it's a young person or old. If the ox gores a male slave or a female slave, okay, now this is a situation where the slave doesn't die, then God sets a price. He says 30 shekels of silver must be given to the master. Okay, so if your ox gores the servant 30, but he doesn't die, the punishment is 30 shekels of silver goes to the master, and the ox is stoned. Sounds kind of fair. Now, if a man is building a cistern, he'll build a pit somewhere out in the field, a deep pit, and he doesn't cover it, and if the man digs a pit and doesn't cover it and the ox or donkey falls in it, the owner of the pit must make restitution. Okay, so this ox falls in the pit, kills him or injures him. He must give money to its owner, and the dead animal will be his. So here you got a pit, probably a cistern's being built, and the man just leaves it open, and that's really dangerous at night. And so this ox or donkey falls in it. The person who dug the pit, it's restitution. You see, this is what we see so much in the Old Testament. It wasn't so much you just go to jail and the person who got injured, well, too bad. What was done is he had to pay for that animal that died, and of course he gets to keep the animal. If the animal hasn't, it could still be good for meat. Depends on the situation. Now we can apply this to modern day times, and we see it done. If you build a swimming pool, it's not okay for you to build a swimming pool in the neighborhood. You got kids and other people, and you just leave it open. Somebody could walk in there, fall and drown, and it's happened. Little kids are always attracted to water, so you have to put a fence around it, right? So that is taking an Old Testament ordinance and moving it into modern day times. We'll see other things about parapets, and as we continue in this, there's a lot of interesting laws. Some of them are kind of jaw-dropping, especially if you've never heard it before. But I think if you think about it, you'll see where it can make some sense. If one man's ox injures his neighbor's ox, now we got two animals injuring each other. So one of them dies. Okay, so this big old ox goes over and kills the smaller ox. Then they must sell the live ox and divide the price. And guess what? They also divide the dead ox. So they share the meat. Doesn't that sound fair? To me, it sounds fair. Now you get sued. Oh, your bull killed my bull. Well, he's worth, all this, and I'm going to take you to court and get a few $1,000,000 from you. Here, it just was very simple. They sold the one that lived, shared the money, divided the price, and they divided the animal. Now, it's not a perfect situation. There might be situations that require more flexibility, but this gives you a good grounds to set up good laws. Or if it's known the ox has a habit, okay, now we go back to this mean ox and habit of goring in the past. The owner didn't keep watch of it. He must pay for the ox. He's going to have to pay for that ox, and the dead animal will be his. So what they do is that's how it works. So if it's known that the ox is in the habit of goring it in the past, the owner did not keep watch over it, he must pay. And the dead animals would be his. So his ox gets stoned, and then he keeps it, and there you go. And he pays for the other one. So you see these types of things being can be used as principles for today. So what we see here is God's justice is balanced. It is measured. It's proportional. Punishment is always proportionate and just. And in personal responsibility, whether it's owning animals, digging pits, or controlling anger, God holds each person accountable to prevent harm. And God values every human life. And the unborn child to the slave, every life carries God's image and is protected. So he's concerned about all these things and just. So next week, Lord willing, we'll continue in Exodus 22, and we're going to see laws, ordinances about theft, crop protection, personal property, and other stuff. And these ordinances reveal more about God's wisdom and his righteousness, and they help us understand him and how to imitate his fairness and mercy. So we'll do that next week. So dear Heavenly Father, thank you for your love for us, and thank you that just help us with our understanding on this. I know some of this is new to people, and it might sound harsh, but when you think about it, it really makes sense. It's just, and you're a good God. And so it's smart for us to change our thinking to match yours, God. And because you are the supreme intelligence, you are no better than everyone. So, and we can see how goodness you dealt with people and you wanted justice here on earth. So bless us this day. Thank you for this teaching. It wasn't a warm and fuzzy teaching, but it's an important teaching. So thank you for each of our lives here, for a wonderful night's sleep tonight, for taking care of our travelers here, and DJ who's helping out with employing Aaron and all the goodness that's going on. Thank you for your love and your blessing on your people. And in the name of Jesus Christ, amen.
Boy, I'm going to watch this.